Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Paul Britton. I'm Chief Executive for Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce, and I'd like to thank colleagues at the Chamber and PwC for asking me to chair this morning's session, Good Growth for Cities Index. So for those of you that are familiar with the work of the Chamber, you'll know that competitiveness is something that we're deeply invested in. It's reflected in our business manifesto, and we talk often about the key role that the Thames Valley has in creating jobs and prosperity across the whole of the UK. No doubt that will be discussed as part of the agenda today. I do have a note to the left of my screen saying it's just got the word impartial on there. So as your chair today, I'm going to look to be impartial. We'll see how that goes. Ladies and gents, actually looking down the cast of the registrations today, if everyone has been able to join us, many of you are just as animated, should we say, about your sectors and communities across the Thames Valley. I'm looking, we've got the MP for Bracknell, James Sunderland. We have leaders in the pharmaceutical sector. We have senior representatives of the Royal Berkshire NHS Foundation Trust. Andrew, thank you for joining us at this particularly busy time. We have the fastest growing privately owned company in the region join us. We have local authority leaders, leaders of the local enterprise partnerships, leaders in public transport, and I note also we have senior representatives of DIT, who, if you're not familiar with DIT, they're the organisation responsible for promoting the UK as a business location. So Teresa, I see you on the list, welcome. So in a long way, it's me saying we're looking forward to a lively Q&A, no doubt. So a little reminder about the Chamber. We're one of 53 accredited chambers of commerce in the UK. Proud to say we're the 5th largest, one of the largest in the network by employees represented, and I have the honour of leading 40 chamber employees, and our role is to represent the business community both by sectors and by place. So for us as an organisation, this report, this PwC report, is a temperature check. It's never been more important, I believe, at this time to discuss the results and the implications, because the implications really matter more now than ever for us as a business, as a chamber, but for all of our members and the wider business community. So I'd like to welcome you all. I'd like to welcome John Ellis. John is Senior Audit Partner at PwC in Reading, and also to George. Welcome, George. George Mason is one of PwC's go-to economists. I joined John at the launch of PwC's impressive new technology hub, their Frontier in Reading, a little while ago, and John is spearheading that investment and has spearheaded that investment himself. And this does represent a wider commitment for PwC to grow and invest in regions outside of the UK. So I'm going to turn to John first. John's going to kick off, and he's going to then be followed up by George's presentation, and then back to John with his reflections on the implications of the results from the report. We're then going to have that Q&A. So I just, you would have heard this before, a reminder that the chat function is there. Please use it. I have colleagues in the background supporting me in my role as chair to ensure we get through as many of those questions and give a time for answers later on during the session. So please don't be shy and get involved in that. So John, it's over to you, sir.
Paul, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thanks ever so much for having us here to talk about our Good Growth for Cities Index. As Paul has said, look, I'll do an intro about the index itself. George, who has done way more work than I have on the index itself, will actually take you through some of the real detailed findings, which hopefully will start to help you think about the questions. And at the end, I'll bring it back and actually talk about what needs to happen. What's the agenda for action? So a bit of background. If you could move on one, Sarah, that would be great. Why have we got the Good Growth Cities report? And I think really this is about moving away from a single view of growth being GVA or GDP, and actually looking at growth across a whole series of different measures that measure the economic well-being of the people in town or in a city. That could be jobs, income, health, skills that they have. This year, I think it's even more important, and this year we focused on the economic impact of COVID-19. I don't think we could have this conversation without mentioning COVID-19, and then layer that on to what we see as being the recovery prospects for each of the towns and cities within the UK. I'll give a couple of observations, more around this region. So those cities that have performed well in the past on Good Growth for Cities, and I would list Oxford, Reading, Swindon as being local towns and cities that have done well, are the ones that have shown the most resilience during the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I would say it is all relative. And I'm sure if you're sat in one of those towns, you're probably thinking it's not great, but actually the performance has been better across those factors that George will take you through. But those factors aren't something that we've come up with. We poll the public as to what they see as being important. They've not changed particularly year on year. So 2020 is very similar to 2019. And we weight those factors, and those weightings are very similar. But what the pandemic has really done is to really highlight some of the differences between towns and cities, and highlighted the inequalities across that spectrum of measures. And I think there's a real expectation that as we come out of the current COVID crisis, those inequalities will be addressed, and that's going to take a huge amount of collaborative effort. And as Paul sort of said in his introduction, there is a really wide range of people listening into this presentation. And I think we all have a part to play, be that whether we're in local government, in business, in central government, around this recovery. And those recoveries need to be place-based, not only to address sort of inequalities between towns and cities, but also to address inequalities within towns and cities. Levelling up isn't just around the different towns and cities within the UK. It's within towns, and it's thinking about how can places become more productive, more innovative? How can they become more fair and more inclusive? How can they become more green, more sustainable? That's going to be really important as we move forward. And actually, as what we've seen through past surveys, how can towns and cities become more resilient to issues that we might face? So without further ado, I will now pass on to George. I think, Sarah, I might have missed a slide, so you might want to flick through one or two, and George will take you through the detail of the report.
Thanks, John. Yes, next slide, please, Sarah. Cool. Yes, just one more, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, so as John has explained, Good Growth was really kind of born out of the want to look past just GVA as a way of measuring a city's overall well-being. So with that in mind, we ran a workshop with Demos back in 2011 with members of the public to try and identify, what are those top variables that matter the most to the public. So we came up with this list here. And as John mentions, we ran a survey, and we continue to run a survey to identify the relative priority of these variables. So we polled roughly 3,000 people, which is matched to the working age of the population, just to understand really how the relative priority of these variables shifts. And then, as John mentioned, we kind of calculate weights based on the results of that survey. So year on year, we don't typically see much change. So this year, for example, we didn't see a shift in any of the index weights. But if you take a longer term view, that's where you start to see more of an impact. So, for example, health has become increasingly important in recent years, and it's now kind of the joint most important variable to a place's overall well-being. So joint with jobs. And you'd expect to see this kind of increase in next year's index as a result of the pandemic. And actually, we conducted this polling in roughly November of 2020. So conversely, jobs is clearly still a top priority, but it's actually declined in importance over the past few years. And that kind of decline in importance, I guess, perhaps shows you over the past few years until recently, the low unemployment rates that the UK's enjoyed relatively. But, you know, with the end of the furlough scheme, you'd expect kind of that importance potentially as well to increase in next year's index. Next slide, please. So how have cities in the Thames Valley performed in this year's index? Next slide, please. So if we start with Reading, what this chart really shows is how Reading performs relative to the index average in absolute terms across each of the variables. So you'll notice here that the chart title says 2017 to 19, and that's because in the index we take a 3-year weighted average for the results. And the reason for that is because data at this level, if you look at it in terms of like the annualized data, it can be quite volatile. So to kind of smooth this out, we use a 3-year average. It should be noted, I guess, that this doesn't include the 2020 data, and that's just because we operate on kind of a year lag for local authority data. So that's what this kind of shows you, I guess, is how cities were performing going into the pandemic. So the scores for each variable here are calculated by comparing how Reading performs in a particular variable relative to what the index average was in 2011-13 using the mean. So what this means is that a positive score here shows that Reading performs better in that variable relative to what the index average was in 2011-13. So for example, the job score, you can see that unemployment rates in Reading in 27-19 are therefore better than what the index average was in 2011-13. So that's why it's got a positive score. And conversely, any variable that's negative on this indicates that the score for that variable is lower than what the index average was in 2011-13. So for example, in Reading, you can see house prices are kind of lower than what they were in 2011-13. And that's also been seen in the index average, which is kind of shown on that yellow bar, but just not as pronounced. So what this chart is showing you is that in absolute terms, Reading performs really well across the majority of variables in the index, and actually places second overall in the Good Growth for Cities report. So in particular, Reading performs well on jobs, income, health, new businesses, skills and environment. Reading suffers though in what we term typical price of success variables. So variables that you tend to see decline as kind of other indicators increase. So that's things like work-life balance, house price to earnings and transport. I think what's particularly interesting in the case of Reading is income distribution. So where Reading performs poorly here in absolute terms, actually the index average is showing a marginally positive score. So what that means is that, you know, Reading's income distribution score is worse than what the average was in 2011-13, whereas the index average is actually marginally higher. So I think that's quite an important point. Next slide, please, Sarah. So looking at Oxford, so this chart is relaying the same information, but for Oxford. So again, you can see really strong performances across the vast majority of variables. So Oxford actually places the top in our index, and it has done for the past few years. So Oxford in particular performs well on jobs, income, health and skills. But like Reading, kind of Oxford suffers from the same type of price of success variables. But I do think it's interesting that Oxford's income distribution score is actually more akin to what the index average is, you know, compared to Reading, what I showed before. Of interest potentially is the work-life balance variable here, and that remains kind of a potential area of improvement for Oxford. Next slide, please. So if we move on to Thames Valley, Berkshire, so this places fourth in our overall LEP index, so not in our cities index, but in our LEPs index. So as you'd expect, Thames Valley also performs strongly on jobs, income, health, new businesses and skills. So kind of broadly similar kind of messaging to Oxford and Reading. But again, it suffers in those price of success variables, with transport in particular, which we measure by commuting times being significantly worse than the LEP average in 2011-13. Next slide, please. Cool. So where the previous charts kind of indicate performance in absolute terms, this chart then shows the change in scores in each variable relative to the index average. So as I noted before, the index uses a 3-year weighted average. So any movement in scores here is really driven by the change between the 2016 and the 2019 data. So our last index looked at 2016-18, and this year's index looks at 2017-19. So if we look at Reading, what we can see is that Reading's seen a marginal increase in its index score relative to last year's index. And that's really being driven by improvements in work-life balance, jobs, income, things like that. But Reading has seen a pronounced decline in the number of new businesses. And I think this is because Reading has seen roughly 600 fewer business births in 2019 compared to 2016. It should be noted, though, that clearly in absolute terms, Reading does perform well in this variable. It's just relative to its high baseline, that change has kind of seen a big decline. And there are also slight declines in health scores and the skills of older workers and income distribution, which is slightly worrying, I guess, given the impact that the pandemic is likely to have on these variables. And it'll be interesting to see, going into 2020 and next year's index, when we have that data, how that then impacts Reading's score. Next slide, please. So Oxford has also seen an improvement in its index score relative to last year's index. And again, this is driven by strong performances across jobs, income and work-life balance. However, income distribution and the skills of young workers have actually seen a pronounced decline. So the skills measure that we use is defined by the number of people in that age group who hold a national vocational qualification of level 3 or above, which is equivalent to A-levels or an advanced diploma. So I think what's driving this change is that in 2016, roughly 70% of 16 to 24-year-olds had an NVQ of 3, and that compares to about 45% in 2019. I should note that, the data can be quite volatile at this level, so it can be dangerous to read too much into it, but it's still, potentially a worrying trend, particularly because we know the impact that, the negative impacts, I should say, that the pandemic is likely to have on the learning outcomes of young people. And also, I guess, worrying trend for income distribution as well. Next slide, please. So finally, then looking at Thames Valley, we can see that Thames Valley has seen a really strong improvement in work-life balance, particularly kind of relative to the index average. And improvements have also been made in jobs and income, but not as much as the increase made in the average city in the index, which is kind of shown by those yellow bars. So like Reading, the variables that have seen the largest declines here are the number of new businesses and then transport as well. Next slide, please. So that data, as I mentioned, covers the period 2017 to 19. So whilst that's interesting and gives you a snapshot of how cities were kind of performing going into the pandemic, or the trends that were occurring prior to the pandemic, this year we've also conducted some additional analysis which looks at how COVID has impacted different cities in 2020, and also, how we expect them to recover in 2021. Next slide, please. So what this chart shows, what it plots is kind of the expected annual GVA impact to each city in 2020, which is shown on the y-axis, against the Good Growth for Cities index score, which is shown on the x-axis. And our expected impact to 2020 takes into consideration things like the sectoral mix of each city, as well as other factors like Google mobility, claimant count, the number of furloughed workers, etc. So both Reading and Oxford have lower impacts or lower expected impacts in 2020 than the UK average city. So, for example, we expect GVA to decline in Oxford by about 9.9% in 2020 and about 10.3% in Reading, which compares to the index average of about 11%. So from this, you can see that both cities perform better than some of the larger cities in the UK, such as London, Manchester, Birmingham. I should say that these are kind of relative to the size of each city's economy. So the absolute economic differences will clearly differ from city to city. But if we apply that 2x2 overlay on this scatter plot, what we can see is that both cities are placed in kind of the upper right quadrant, which is kind of the high good growth score and the low economic impact, which means that we estimate Oxford and Reading to be fairly resilient to the impacts of COVID-19 and kind of come out of the pandemic better than some of the other cities that we have in the index. There's also a loose relationship between cities that perform well on the index and the expected impact of COVID-19, which shows that generally cities that perform better on the index tend to have a lower economic impact in 2020 than cities that perform badly. But there are some exceptions to this, and that's why it's not kind of a complete causal relationship. So places such as Leicester, which have a high good growth score, so Leicester placed 8th in this year's index, they've been significantly impacted by COVID in 2020 and have much greater expected impact than similar performing cities like Cambridge, Swindon and Aberdeen, which are supposed to be more resilient. And that's primarily fueled by the fact that Leicester has had a significant increase in kind of COVID-19 infection rates back in the summer, which led to the local lockdown of the city. Next slide, please. So this bubble chart then plots each city's GVA growth rates in 2020 and 2021. So on the y-axis there, you can see the expected 2021 impact to GVA, and on the x-axis, you can see the same for 2020. So the size of the bubbles here show the relative size of each city's economy in absolute terms. So Liverpool is expected to be the most impacted city in 2020 GVA growth terms, contracting by 13.3%. And on the other hand, Edinburgh is expected to fare the best, so contracting by just 9.1%. So you can see that kind of Oxford and Reading, going back to kind of previous slide, Oxford and Reading are kind of 9.9% and 10.3% respectively. So in the grand scheme of things, expect to perform better. So we also predict that cities that have been impacted by the pandemic heavily will have better recovery prospects in 2021. And that's kind of shown by that dotted line of best fit on the chart. So when we look at the 2021 annual GVA growth rates, it's Medway and Doncaster that are estimated to have the best growth rates. So Medway is estimated to grow by 5.7% and Doncaster 5.6% in 2021 compared to where they were in 2020. And Reading and Oxford in comparison are expected to have slightly more muted growth at 4.3% and 4.2% respectively. But that is partly driven by the fact that their economies are expected to be less impacted in 2020. So it's all about kind of where the absolute baseline is coming from. Next slide, please. So this slide then demonstrates the underlying sectoral mix of Reading and Oxford, which helps to explain the expected impact in 2020. So as I said, the methodology uses sectoral mix as quite a strong driver in our forecasts. So we've included this as our economic analysis, as I said, includes that estimated sectoral impacts. So I think it's interesting here, in particular, Reading, nearly a quarter of Reading's economy is in the information and communication sector, which includes technology companies. And we estimate that this sector is expected to not be as badly impacted as others. So I think the forecast is roughly -7% in 2020 compared to, say, 39% in accommodation and food service activities. And similarly, Oxford's economy has a high proportion of its economy in the real estate sector, so roughly 15.6%. So we estimate that sector will actually see quite little impact in 2020. So I think it's only expected to contract by about 1%, with a lot of real estate services continuing to operate during the pandemic. So I guess the one thing to take away from this is that the sectoral mix of both Oxford and Reading are really important to how resilient we expect both of those economies to be in 2020 relative to others. Next slide, please. So this map shows kind of the take-up rate of the UK furlough scheme across local authorities in Oxford and Reading. So both cities here observe lower than average rates of 8.1% in the UK, but there are areas where there's kind of higher rates. So you can see that in this map through kind of the darker shading. So Cotswold Local Authority, for example, in the west of Oxford, roughly 8.1% of employments here were on furlough at the end of October. And in Windsor and Maidenhead, so towards the east of Reading, there's also 8.6% of workers were on the furlough scheme at the end of October. So I think this is important, I guess, going forwards, which John will talk about, is the impact that there is in kind of the labour market. That's going to then kind of have ripple through effects in next year's Good Growth for Cities Index. So again, in kind of important considerations. What I would say is, this colour scaling here is done relative to themselves. So the colour scaling is done by comparing Oxford and Reading. So actually, if you look at the dark shading, you'll note I just mentioned kind of the average is 8.1%. That would actually sit in the darker shading here. So if you used kind of the UK average, and you can see it in our report online, actually, Oxford and Reading comparatively would be quite a light shade. So just to note that there are darker shades here, but it's kind of relative to themselves. So for example, Crawley, I think, has the highest percentage on furlough, roughly 13%. And that's driven by the local employment's reliance on Gatwick Airport, for example. So that's kind of the results. Hopefully you found this interesting. I think John's now I'll pass back to John, who's going to talk you through a bit more about what those results mean for local leaders and businesses.
Thank you very much, George. And Sarah, if you could just move on one slide, that would be great. I think this presentation particularly is focused on Reading and Oxford, given they are number 1 and 2 in the index. The other local towns, including Swindon, also perform well in the survey, as well as the other local economic partnerships, the other LEPs. So George mentioned there the Thames Valley Berkshire LEP, but the other 2 local LEPs also perform well in the index, which I think is an indication of the relative performance of the wider Thames Valley in the Good Growth for Cities report. So where next, and what are the implications of all this? Sarah, if you could move on. I think it's now clearer than ever we need to do something, and as I mentioned at the start, we need to do something that is considers a broader approach to well-being. This is levelling up more than just GDP. This is levelling up the way in which people live in our towns and cities. So that's the social, health, and economic outcomes. So again, if you can move on. So what would be the areas that we would say are really important? And I've kind of touched on these as we've gone through. One is around fairness. The places that we live need to be inclusive, and we need to support the people who are most vulnerable in those places where we live. That includes the younger workers. We need to be helping support people in their training, in their education. We need to focus on productivity. Without that, we won't have vibrant economies, and that's going to involve investment in entrepreneurship, investment in innovation. Those will be the areas that really drive the economic recovery. That also needs to be sustainable. And again, as I said at the start, I think a green recovery will have to be at the heart of every one of our recovery plans. We need to create places where people want to live. I like many people on this call today, I've got way more used to my local environment than I had previously. I know my local town. I live in Ealing, way better than I did previously. And the high street, the place where we live is going to be really, really important. And as a consequence, needs to be a place where people want to live. And then finally, and again, as I said at the start, those towns that have shown resilience are the ones that have performed better in the survey. And as a consequence, putting continued resilience at the front and centre of recovery is going to be important. And how are we going to do that? Well, it's got to come through three different routes. That's central government, local leaders, and business. And I think broadly, and there's a lot more detail in our report, central government needs to be setting the strategy and the key measures that allow local towns and cities to deliver on the changes that they want to make. Local leaders need to ensure that they are setting ambitious plans, really great plans for recovery to a place where people want to ensure we've got places where people want to be. And to do that, it's going to be the local leaders that are going to need to drive that collaboration between themselves and with business and with the public. And then finally, business and business has to play its part. Business has to focus on some of the things we've just talked about there. For example, productivity. It's down to business to think about, well, how can we really drive entrepreneurship? How can we drive innovation? And also, business has a real part to play in education and skills, engaging with education providers, engaging with apprenticeship schemes, but also helping employees really improve their own skills, so that continued training, that continued investment in people. And once you've got all those, you'll start to have an environment where each of those factors that we've talked about can really improve. That's probably enough from George and I. Paul, I will hand it over to you now to chair the Q&A.
Thank you, John, and thank you, George. Had me leaning in, George, to those stats. I think for many on the there's a lot of detail in there. So the full report is obviously available, but I think in particular your snapshot that refers to post-COVID, that's really interesting. I mean, can you just to start with a couple of questions of my own, and encourage everybody to use the chat box to get your points across. You mentioned we shouldn't be surprised to see the focus on health as one of the key weightings. Can we expect that to increase notably? And are there any thoughts on how that might impact for the future in terms of the Thames Valley? Because the pandemic clearly has had a significant impact, particularly for those larger cities as well, where we're dependent on public transport and underground and so on. So any thoughts on that, George, and to you, John, as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think definitely I'd be really interested to see if we ran a poll again, even now, say, how we'd expect the importance of health to have increased, even since kind of September, October. That's kind of time when we actually ran the initial polling. I think it's important to say that at the moment, we've received feedback from people over the past couple of years about the variable that we use to measure health, which is currently the percentage of people who are economically inactive due to long-term sickness. I think now, given the wake of the pandemic, I think it'll be important for us to reassess that variable. How do we actually think, what do we think is the best variable to actually go about measuring that now? And I think, we can think about that in broader terms. So I think, in next year's index, I think what we'll do is try and maybe even start from scratch again and have a revisit of all the different variables we look at and what matters most to the public. So to answer your question, I'd expect health to increase in importance, and I think also if we change the measure of what health is, that could have significant implications on kind of the measure of overall well-being, not just for Reading and Oxford and Swindon and kind of the index, but lots of the other cities too.
John, any reflections on what that could mean, implications for the region?
So, I mean, I completely agree with everything George has just said there. The other angle I would add to it, I think, is mental health. And I know that the Chamber has been giving a lot of thought to mental health within businesses, but this pandemic will, I think, bring a tidal wave of concern over people's mental health, as it is doing at the moment. So I think health in itself will need to be considered in a very broad way, over and above just what the sort of the immediate implications of COVID itself. I think there is a lot to do in terms of thinking about how business, how local authorities can support people as we come out of the pandemic.
So perhaps, George, to your point, leaning less towards inactivity or activity, but more around productivity in terms of health in that respect. Okay, yeah. Thanks, John. Thanks, George. Okay, so we have some questions now in the chat. Got a question from Alex Tilley. So Alex represents a software technology firm, and his question relates to that sector. It says, regarding the technology sector, job creation and resiliency of the tech and telecom sectors, do you feel a stronger planning system to promote these uses is required? We found limitations with outdated local plans unable to cater for uses such as data centers, which the world relies upon. Any thoughts or reflections on that?
Shall I have a go? I think that the answer is probably in the question as well, Alex. In that, I think the answer is yes. In the context of what I said around how does everybody work collaboratively to drive productivity and innovation. And if we genuinely believe, and I personally do, I think technology is hugely important in this agenda, that in order to drive that innovation and productivity, we need to invest in technology businesses, and we need to allow technology businesses to thrive. Then absolutely yes, it's incumbent upon that collaboration with local government and central government to ensure that business can thrive in a way that is appropriate, with the caveats that we also need to ensure that we are continuing to be sustainable and providing that fairness.
And we have work to do, don't we, John? George, I mean, I'm just looking at the comment from Bob Beveridge, who's chair of the Local Enterprise Partnership in Berkshire. We fared well in this in these results, but it points to a 10.3% decline, maybe marginally less bad than average, but it's still very significant and needs actions. I think that's a point as well of a question, which probably we're not going to argue with. But any reflections on that from either of you?
I mean, as I said at the start, it is all relative, and I don't think we're not here saying that the towns in the Thames Valley have done well. The towns in the Thames Valley have suffered relatively less badly than other places in the country, but they have still suffered. And I think it's really important that levelling up is considered both within towns and cities, and as well as within the country as a whole. There's still a lot of inequality within towns and cities, and so Bob is absolutely right. It's not 10.3% decline is not a good number.
Yeah, agreed.
And just what we're sorry, George, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, completely agree with that. 10.3% isn't a good number. It's just kind of relative to the other cities. It's kind of marginally better. I think what's going to be important, I guess, over the next year from, I guess, an economics point of view will be kind of how duration of that third national lockdown, how long is that going to be? How's that going to continue to impact different sectors, you know, the local tiering systems as well? And then I guess more broadly, how businesses react to the trading relationship with the EU as well. and then also kind of the US-UK relationship, what happens there as well. So just other things to consider going forwards.
Absolutely, we're an international business location. That I think is the point that maybe Marcus Johnson, who's our local chamber president for Reading and Woking, is making. So thanks, John and George. I just wondered whether you thought had driven the reduction of 600 new businesses arriving in Reading since 2016. So you can see as chair here, I'm sticking in the shade at the moment before we go into some light in terms of discussion. But you can see there are challenges here. I mean, are there any thoughts? And perhaps George, you've already shared some headlines there about some of the macroeconomic changes. Any thoughts in terms of response to that? So is it, thoughts on what has driven the reduction, perhaps in terms of competitiveness of Reading, or in terms of new businesses arriving in Reading?
I mean, the data that we have on this variable is from the ONS, which just kind of tells us business births. I don't know specifically what might have driven that change. So be interesting to look into. I would say that actually quite a few of the higher performing cities have seen a decrease in new businesses scores actually in this year's index. So I think generally in high performing cities, what that would indicate is 2016 saw quite a lot of business growth, and 2019 still relatively high baseline levels, but obviously there's been that contraction. It might just be things like kind of the impact of Brexit, for example. We're seeing kind of a shrinking business confidence, which might have been one potential impact relative to 2016, but I wouldn't be able to comment on what the exact kind of change in jobs in Reading was without looking into it further, unfortunately.
Okay, George.
I mean, apologies. Sorry, Paul.
No.
It is interesting because if I sort of reflect on what we see within PwC in Reading around new business, I still feel as though there is a vibrant economy there of new businesses being born. I did sort of, whilst we were going through the information, did look at the relative number of new businesses coming out of Oxford compared to Reading, and we're seeing a huge number of new biotech business births, for example, coming out of Oxford, and they tend to be Oxford based as opposed to Reading based. So I think there are definitely new businesses. Looking at the data, that's probably not the factor I worry about the most. I think there is a lot of vibrancy in new businesses in the Thames Valley.
So you mentioned Oxford there, John, and pointed to one of the sector strengths for Oxford in particular. I mean, are we starting to see for communities like Oxford and Swindon and further afield, it's actually the existing sectors and where we're tried and tested in those? Is that what's proving resilience? Is the existing suite of sectors that are representing communities playing an even more significant part than they were before?
I think it goes back to the chart that George showed as to the relative performance of different sectors. So if you have got a town that isn't reliant on an individual sector, then I think they have shown more resilience. If you've got a town, though, for example, that is very reliant, and I've noticed Nigel's put a comment in the box as well, very reliant, for example, on hospitality and retail, then actually that will have shown a decline, just given what has happened as a consequence of the various lockdowns. So I think having focus is great, and as we've talked about, having a technology focus is fantastic in a time when there is real growth in those industries. But that focus can also be a weakness if you don't have a broad spread of industry when you do hit a downturn that might affect those industries differently.
So how do we see that? I mean, we've got policymakers and senior representatives of local authorities. I mean, how do we see that representing itself, perhaps in terms of local policies to either attract investment or secure investment in the future? Might we see a more proactive role in terms of focusing on one sector or another in terms of our planning?
I mean, Paul, I think it's I think when you do have a hub, and let's take the technology industry in Reading, which I would say is a hub, you will always build a sort of an infrastructure around that particular hub, because you want to create a community, create a sort of an environment where innovation can breed. So you don't want to stop it, and you do need to help drive that continued investment. I think, though, the only sort of caveat I will give is if you become wholly reliant on one particular industry, if that industry starts to suffer, then you're going to get a poorer performance in the scores. So it's a real balance. I think you absolutely want to ensure that you're driving innovation, driving growth, but it's sort of don't put all your eggs in one basket, I think, would be my message.
Yeah, I mean, there's been tremendous merit in positioning this part of the world. You can call the Thames Valley, draw boundaries about it how you like, but you know, Silicon Valley of the UK, of Europe has fared well in the past for us, and that's embraced a number of sectors that you could still consider growth sectors. But yes, the impact, if you're focused on one sector or another, is clearly going to be disproportionate if those sectors if you're less competitive, those sectors in the future. And that, I think, is the core of Gareth's question here. And perhaps this is one to pause on and may prompt some more questions from those that are listening in as well. It says, George, what are the key messages in regard to the future of the levelling up agenda and the need to sustain investment in successful cities and regions of the Thames Valley? John, can I start with you? And I'll have some thoughts on that as well. Now, but, this is a question that's in the it's in the headlights, isn't it? What role and what messages the Thames Valley could and should adopt in providing a wider solution to the UK challenges that we're now facing?
It's a really difficult question, because if you're sat, I mean, I grew up in West Yorkshire, if you're sat in Bradford or Keighley, which is a town I lived in, and you look and you think, relatively, the performance of the different cities within the UK, you're going to look at the Thames Valley and think, well, why would government invest more in the Thames Valley? That's just not fair. However, in order to have a thriving UK economy, you also need to ensure that the places that really are driving that economy continue to get the right level of support and investment as well. Now, that might mean that more needs to come from within in the Thames Valley, rather than there being huge infrastructure projects being invested in the Thames Valley, for example. But you can't forget it. You can't forget the growth, the engine that comes from places like the Thames Valley. So I think there's probably, in answer to Gareth's question, there is more that we as a business community and community more generally in the Thames Valley need to do to support ourselves. But that is in the interests of the country as well. I think we probably have to accept that more of the investment coming from central government is likely to be in towns and cities that aren't geographically that close to us here.
I'm just looking at that note that I've got on the side of my screen talking about being non-parochial, but if you'll give me, I mean, on levelling up, every member that I talk to, every member that I speak to wants to see shared UK prosperity. And in fact, when I'm talking to my counterparts across the other 52 chambers across the UK, all chief executives are telling me the UK needs to maintain our high-performing regions. You know, the success of Reading and Swindon and Oxford does create jobs across the UK, and perhaps sometimes we oversimplify how business investment actually happens. And there's an early example of that, or most recent example for me personally, that the Chamber is involved in working with a well, it's very topical. You've got a year ago when the pandemic struck, we had one vaccine manufacturing plant in the UK, and that was in Liverpool, and that was run and operated by an Australian-owned flu vaccine manufacturer that not many had heard of, called Seqirus. And that now employs 200 people plus, and there's Theresa from DIT who will know about this project as well, because we're working on it jointly. But winning that investment for Liverpool was predetermined by whether we won the global headquarters for that new venture, because it was a new venture by Novartis and a group called CSL. So when Theresa May opened the new facility in Maidenhead in 2015, and it created 20 jobs in Maidenhead, it created 10 times more jobs in Liverpool. And so I think in whatever policies, whatever industrial strategy, there's going to be a debate, isn't there, George, about what now happens in terms of level of intervention. I think whatever happens, I think we've got to remember that there is a role for really focusing upon the merits of one region as centres of excellence. We've heard that a lot, because if we hadn't have won that for Maidenhead, it would have been in Germany, and the manufacturing facility would have been in Germany. That's what we were up against, if I remember rightly, Theresa. And I'll get an email shortly. So how we explain that, how we get that message right for those that will try to understand what was in play is important. And I know that the local enterprise partnerships across the Thames Valley are working very hard to try to make sure that that's presented in a way that central government understand and can be articulated. George, John, any other further comments on that? And I'll check if we've got any other questions.
Paul, I agree with you. I think it's about being smart as to the message that we put out in the Thames Valley, and being focused on what we are really good at and how that will really help the rest of the country. So I think your example is an absolutely fantastic one. I've also had conversations with other people who are on the call about still the importance of levelling up within towns and cities as well. And I think that is an area where absolutely we should be looking for support from central government to ensure that we are being as fair as possible within, as well as in the whole of the UK. I did notice Gareth's comment on Bradford being top of the index 110 years ago. I'm not sure we ran it 110 years ago. That does highlight one thing though. In about 110 years ago in Bradford, I'm sure many people would know, Bradford is hugely reliant on its textile industry. And there are many closed mills that are now flats in Bradford that, because the textile industry broadly moved out of the UK. So that was a city that probably had put too many eggs in one basket in terms of its what was driving its economy.
Very good. Okay, I've got one eye on time, and I'm now going to invite Adrian to share a few messages about other events that are coming up, and then I'll share some closing remarks and try to draw together a lot of those messages into something we can take away and work on positively together, I think is the key message. Adrian, over to you.
Paul, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, John and George, for enlightening us all here this morning. Good morning, everybody. The first event I would like to signpost your attention to is our upcoming collaborative roundtable piece between Business Alliance members, Page Group and Blake Morgan, titled, as you can see on the screen, Talent Attracting, Engaging and Retaining in 2021. We're really excited to work with both BA members to deliver this roundtable presentation, and it comes at a critical time of change and adjustment across the world, of course. Our guest panelists from Page and Blake Morgan will discuss its implications for the labour market. Attendees on the day will be invited to participate in the live discussion, which also will make for a lively, engaged production. While this February 10th event is currently fully booked, reserve list bookings are being accepted, and we do encourage those interested to contact the Chamber at your earliest. Next slide, please. Thanks, Sarah. As we know, the UK has now left the EU single market, and a new era of customs and checks on goods moving between the UK and EU countries has indeed arrived. It's vital that all businesses are proactive in ensuring that they're set up to move from the single market EU approach to full customs procedures, documentation, duties, and VAT. We are delighted that on Thursday, February the 11th, Steve McCrindle, who is VAT partner with Haynes Watts, will deliver this webinar, which will take us through the changes and the options available for traders to manage their VAT arrangements and liabilities. There will be an opportunity for delegates to raise questions prior to the webinar on the day. That's Thursday, February 11th at 10:30, and booking can be done via the link on the event page, which is at thamesvalleychamber.co.uk/event, where you will also see the full event listing. That's it from me. Back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. So thanks to our team working with our members. So those are 2 of the 120 events that we run each year on behalf of you, our members. So reflections. I think my main reflection is a good time to pause. I think the cast of businesses and schools, universities and local authorities that are on this call reflects that the amount of work that's been going on to overcome those enormous challenges. And I think that George's point about being in a position in a year's time to look at the next PwC Good Growth Report, it is going to require an almighty collective effort to ensure that we stay resilient. And in the words of Keith Ellis, who's the chairman of PwC, he says our communities need a strong economy and a thriving business to function. And my words would be, we need organisations like LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, to be supported. And they need to be informed to help us to navigate through this recovery. So I believe this session will help us to identify that there are shared challenges across the wider Thames Valley. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, John. Thank you, George. There is light at the end of this pandemic tunnel. It may still be some way off, but the light is brighter than ever, ladies and gents. And of course, we have the 6 nations to enjoy. Stay well, stay safe. Thank you very much for joining us. All the best.